Hey, my name is Eugene Sepulveda. I'm one of the co-founders of Culturati. Thank you for being here. And it is, I love how many of you are here. We still have, we're full tomorrow. I think there's 3 slots left. So there will be 250 people, 240 something people in the room. And we have a huge group of first-timers, and I'm glad that we had the first-time reception, mostly so that you could just meet each other and not feel like you're the only one. Every year, it's about a third to half of the room that's new. So Culturati, it's all about culture. How many of us have taken the time to give a definition of culture? Do you have a one-sentence definition of culture? So Heather Bruner says his culture is all about our values and action. Mark McLean says culture is how we treat each other. Brett Hurt says culture is our operating system, our values, our foundation as a company. And then in one of my favorite books, not the favorite book this year, because we'll hear more about that in a little bit, but is from Ben Horowitz. That says culture is about the decisions people make when we're not around. So I just find it, and I hope during the time that you're here, if you've already not kind of scripted your elevator speech for culture, do so, and just let that be the filter through which we have a lot of conversations. This evening and tomorrow, we'll of course be talking a lot about culture, as we've done the last 4 years, but we'll also be talking more about leadership. What are cultures of leadership? How do we lead cultures? And as we're doing this, I have to introduce a couple of folks. First, Josh Jones-Dilworth, Josh right there, our co-founder. Autumn back here, Autumn Rich, who's our producer and is mine and Josh's partner in everything Culturati. And then if you're on the steering committee or in the program committee, please raise your hand. There's a lot of folks. Thank you. Our sponsors, so we have a new presenting sponsor this year, presenting underwriter, Aduro. And from Aduro, we have Matthew, Dr. White, Dr. Best, Ray, Renee, Jessica. Welcome to the family. I say this all over the place. I developed a crush on Matthew very quickly because he thinks the way that we do and expansively. 3 years ago, if you remember, how many of you were here 3 years ago? 2017. So do you remember that panel, the first panel that Peter Zandan put together that had Matthew Dowd and Brett Hurt and Kelly? I think you were on that panel, right? And at the conclusion of it was, if corporations are citizens, aren't we the most influential citizens in our country? And therefore, don't we have a responsibility to take a stand on political and social issues? At the same time, you get Lawrence Fink's from BlackRock's letter to CEOs of companies saying, I'm not going to invest in you if you aren't taking a stand on social and political issues. And, that wasn't altruistic, or it wasn't just sweet. We're also reading from the Edelman reports, and it was reaffirmed this year that investors, at that time, 76% of investors, institutional investors, wanted to see that the investees were making social and political statements. It can be on either side, but now's the time that we have to emerge with our voices, not only as a corporation, but on behalf of our stakeholders. Also, as sponsors, Return and DLA Piper. So the Johns, I know one John is here, another John is getting ready to host a dinner. Jen, Sam, Amy, Nikki. I've been doing business, and DLA has been supporting things that I've been working on for 20 years, so thank you guys. And that was before DLA was in Austin. NACD is returning, and you're going to be hearing from our friends, and particularly from Aaron. NACD is the most important voice in governance issues, and they write white papers that help direct the best and most important board of directors for public companies, not for public companies, and not for-profit companies. And we'll hear a little bit more about that. Other sponsors that are really important: JDI, Capital Factory, Extension Health, Atlassian, CBRE, Chiso's Boots, Culture Amp, HEB, Haggerty, MEC, National Instruments, New Waterloo, Nautilus Ventures, Panacea, Cellpoint, Silicon Labs, South by Southwest, C3, Talent Robot, Bill and Cindy Bach, Albert Swatner. If you know me and you're my friend and you're not a sponsor, you will be next year, okay? Thank you to all the sponsors, please. So just a quick history, Culturati, particularly since there's so many new people. In 2012, at the Entrepreneurs Foundation board meeting, I think it was like the April board meeting, we started talking about the conversations in boardrooms or just meeting with CEOs were increasingly about recruiting and retention, or cause-related marketing, or how do we generate an identity among customers around our brand. And I remember that conversation being specifically around Whole Foods, which was rolling out a new brand. And you know, we started saying, you know, that's all culture, but people weren't using that term in 2012. Fast forward to 2014, big surprise, I'm talking to Josh Jones-Dilworth about it, and Josh is like, oh my God, that's really important. We got to drill down and decode it, and let's get the smartest people in the country together, and let's come up with a really cool name, a la Culturati. And then intended to be kind of like literati, you know, a society, a community of people that study both the science and the art, that are trying to push the envelope, and to engage the academy. Back in 2014, there wasn't much academic study outside of major corporations or the consultants around the components of culture. There's a whole lot more today. And we're very, very privileged to have Professor Ethan Burris and Professor Dave Altunian as our resident scholars. You know, at last year's summit, we started thinking, I had this conversation with many of you, and I think we talked about it at the opening reception. Why is it that at companies might be the only place today consistently where Republicans, Democrats, and independents, black, white, and brown, straight, gay, trans, non-binary, and Christian, Jewish, Muslim, agnostic, atheist, why is the workplace the only place where we really can agree and get shit done? You know, and that's, you know, thank God at least there. And several people came up to me afterwards and said, Eugene, it's because of a paycheck. Well, when that's the motivation, that's not where we're getting the best stuff done. I suggest that it's common values, common purpose, and, you know, inspiring leadership. And so we have, you know, Josh and Autumn and I have been all over the country and really all over the world for the last year with hundreds of conversations. You know, we've hosted dinners all over the country. We've been to all the culture conferences. We've been to lots of different, not culture conferences, but having these conversations. And that's what made us focus on the leadership around culture. And these are the conversations that we want to have with you over the next 36 hours. So thank you for being here for those. You know, I think it was, 3 days ago, Thursday, how many days ago was that? Where we lost an important American icon from Harvard, Professor Clay Christensen. And many of you know the book about disruption. But what I found interesting is, so in 2010, and I'm trying to remember how much of this led my thinking. There were a few things that happened around that time. You know, we had the recession in 2008, but he wrote, he tried to apply his research to how will I know if my life is worth living? And he was a man of great faith, but he really influenced people who didn't consider themselves very faithful, but they're spiritual. And he warned us that in business as in life, we can't become overly reliant on quantitative measures of our success. He warned us against only measuring success financially in our business or in our lives. He suggested that eventually we would be measured by the number of people who we impacted positively or using his phrase, the number of people that we blessed. I want to suggest that culture, corporate culture that drives performance, the next step for us, and many of you are already doing this, and this is where I get it from, is about further developing the individuals, not only so that they can thrive and prosper in the workplace, but so that they can thrive and prosper in their families and in their communities. And this may be, business is the most trusted institution in America today, way above government, way above the fourth estate, way above religion. And it may be incumbent upon us, where people know to come together and follow under a common vision, values, objectives to get stuff done. It may be incumbent upon us to further develop leadership for families and in the community. Thank you for joining us at this 5th Culturati Summit. I'm going to ask my dear friend Aaron Essemacher to come up and introduce our keynote speaker. I mentioned to you guys National Association Corporate Directors. They set the standards for corporate governance. We connected first 2 or 3 years ago when they did a white paper on boards' involvement and responsibilities around culture. Aaron was then the head of programming and is now the president of the organization. Aaron?
Thank you, Eugene. I am thrilled to be here with my NACD colleagues for what is my 3rd Culturati Summit. So for those of you that are first-timers, you are in for a real treat. I'm also honored to be introducing our opening keynote tonight. It strikes me that as an admiral, you need to have many qualities in order to lead. And the first is a steady hand under pressure. When I first met Admiral Stavridis, it was actually backstage at our NACD Global Board Leaders Summit last fall. He and I were chatting, waiting for the speaker before him to finish up so he could go on and give his talk. And as we're chatting, we're watching the clock tick down and watching the speaker go over by 2 minutes, and 5 minutes, and 10 minutes, and 15 minutes. And when you're running a tightly choreographed conference for 2,000 CEOs and board leaders, needless to say, every minute that you get behind schedule creates a logistical nightmare. On top of that, I knew that the Admiral had to leave immediately after his talk to catch a flight. So to say that I was a little stressed out would be a bit of an understatement. In between frantic texts with my team to kind of come up with a contingency plan, I went over to apologize to him for the delay, and I kind of expected him to give me a little bit of, thinly veiled frustration. And instead, he kind of just laughed and threw his hands up and said, "What are you gonna do? You can't cut off your board chair." So his grace and humor were calming to me, and it was my first experience of the leadership qualities that have made him such a powerful force. First in the military as the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, and now as a leader in the private sector, leading boards and other organizations. In his talk in DC that morning, he also spoke eloquently of our need to listen deeply, both to our allies and to our opponents, and especially when the person that we're listening to we don't agree with them. And he really emphasized that that's so important because with that listening comes understanding. And as Eugene alluded to, that understanding is really the key to what heals us and what will move us forward, both as companies and as a country. And he also said something else that really stayed with me that morning. We need to move our values at scale. And it strikes me that that's what Culturati is all about, and that's what our next 24 hours together is all about. Learning how the best leaders steward strong, high-performing cultures so we can apply those learnings to our own organizations and together scale the idea of business as a force for good in our communities and in the world. His new book, which apparently is now Eugene's favorite book of the year, 10 Admirals and the Voyage of Courage, is a meditation on leadership and character, and it couldn't be more in alignment with the theme of this year's Culturati, and really with the thirst that we all have, I know, as business leaders and as Americans. Ladies and gentlemen, Admiral James Stavridis.
Thank you, Aaron. It's so kind. Thank you. Thank you. Well, good evening, everybody. Aaron, what a delightful introduction. Very, very kind. And great to be here. Josh and Eugene asked me to come and do this talk, and I'm deeply happy always to be in Austin. My daughter went to UT, so, Generally, when people hear that introduction and they see my biography and Supreme Allied Commander of NATO and all that, then they actually see me. And they typically have two reactions. One is, boy, I thought you'd be taller than you appear to be. And the other thing is, they will say, if they know my career in the Navy, they'll say, well, you know, Stavridis, if you're that cool, why were you not a Navy fighter pilot, you know, like Goose and Maverick? I just drove ships around. But truth be told, I desperately wanted to be a Navy fighter pilot when I was growing up, but I had a very traumatic experience when I was a young boy in an airport that made aviation very difficult for me. So here's the plan, and I'm going to do this in 30 brisk minutes. We're going to talk not so much about leadership, we're going to talk about character. And I'd like you to think of it this way. Leadership is this big door that kind of swings in the world and influences others. And that door can be for good or for ill. FDR was a great leader, right? He led the United States through the Great Depression, through the Second World War. Pol Pot of Cambodia was a great leader for very evil purposes. The door is leadership. The hinge that door swings on is character. It's the human heart. And that is what determines the effectiveness or not of that door of leadership swinging in the world. So I determined I wanted to write a book about this because I think we're kind of awash in books on leadership. We're underweight in thinking about character. Character are the small, quiet things you consider late at night. Character is what you do when you think no one is looking. So let's talk about character, and the frame I use is the oceans and admirals, because I know the oceans. I spent much of my 37 years in the Navy at sea. I've studied these leaders at sea, and I think I've come to know their character. So we're going to look at 10 admirals very quickly, going back 2,500 years, and then we'll look at some qualities of character that emerge. So let's get underway. We'll go back 2,500 years ago. This is Themistocles, an ancient Greek admiral. He faces an existential threat. Tiny Greece, particularly his city-state of Athens, is under attack by the Persian Empire. And he knows he's desperately outnumbered. And he must force a battle in the Bay of Salamis outside of Athens. And yet he is outnumbered in ships, in those triremes that are rowed in this ancient period. He's outnumbered 7-1 by the Persians. But he has one crucial advantage. He knows that every one of the oarsmen in the Greek ships is a free man. Every one of the oarsmen in the Persian ships are slaves. And thus he gathers his rowers together on the night before the battle, and he says to them, tomorrow you must row for your families. Tomorrow you must row for your city. Tomorrow you must row for freedom itself. And they get underway the next morning and they destroy the Persian fleet. The quality here, it's the audacity of his vision. It is his ability to communicate and inspire. It is overcoming existential threat. It is a triumph. But he comes back to the city. He's now regarded as the great savior of Athens. But in his sudden conceit, his ego overwhelms him, and he alienates all of those in Athens that he has saved. It is quite literally a Greek tragedy in the sense that his ego outruns even the massive accomplishments of saving his city. And he ends his life, he's banished by the Athenians, and he ends his life in the court of Xerxes, the Persian. It's a story of ego as a character flaw. That is a buoy we should watch for in this voyage. Themistocles of Athens. Let's jump forward and go to another part of the world. This is Zheng He, ancient Chinese admiral. Now we're in the year 1400. He starts life in the worst circumstances I can imagine. He's captured by Chinese raiders, taken back to the court of the emperor, 8 years old. He's castrated and becomes a slave. That's as bad a beginning as I can imagine for anybody. Yet he rises up in the ranks of the court of the Yongle Emperor of China, about 1400, and he becomes an admiral in charge of great treasure fleets that sail the waters of China all the way to India, to Africa. And by the way, to give you a sense of scale, this is the year 1400. These ships of the Chinese emperor's fleet are those massive wooden ones on the slide. You see that tiny little toy boat next to it? That's a scale model of Christopher Columbus's flagship, the Santa Maria. The Chinese are sailing 600-foot massive wooden structures, while the Europeans are discovering America in these tiny, comparatively tiny carvels. The emperor rewards him, moves him through the system of the court, and makes him the leader of all of China's military. This is a story of resilience, of overcoming the worst of circumstances in order to rise steadily through the ranks. Resilience. Let's look at another admiral. So here is someone who's complicated. This is Sir Francis Drake. How many of you have been to the ride in Disney World, Pirates of the Caribbean? Everybody. That's his story. He is the raider who operates under a letter of marque from the Queen of England and becomes this military force in the Caribbean. He is a rapist, a torturer, a slaver. He is despicable in many aspects of his character. Yet, he leads the British-English forces in the battle that is the defeat of the Spanish Armada. He sails the Golden Hind, that's his flagship. He's the first commander to circumnavigate the entire world. Magellan, who most of us think of, actually died before that expedition landed itself. So he's a pirate, but he's a patriot. He is this dichotomy of character, which still today is an old ghost that rattles through the Caribbean Sea. Before I was the NATO commander, I spent 4 years as Commander U.S. Southern Command, in charge of all military activity south of the United States. Everywhere I went in the Caribbean and in Northern South America, I would be taken to the Naval Museum and shown the exploits of Drake the pirate. So this is character, this duality that can exist. On the one hand, decisive, capable. On the other hand, despicable. That door of leadership swings in a way that is not so attractive in Sir Francis Drake. Well, let's look at another Brit who I like a lot. This is Lord Nelson, Horatio Nelson. He saves the British Empire, much as Themistocles wins the naval battle that saves ancient Greece. Nelson fights the Battle of Trafalgar. Many of you have been to London, right? You've been to Trafalgar Square. It's named after this battle, and that pinnace at the very top of it, that's Horatio Nelson. He's a hero of his country. He is well known for teamwork and building teams in an era in which the British Navy is incredibly harsh. He is someone who cares deeply about his sailors. He builds this band of brothers. Was he perfect? Not so much. He has an affair out of wedlock with the beautiful Emma Hamilton. He conceives a daughter. He is a flagrant adulterer throughout much of his life. He's also a publicity hound, and he's also a very difficult subordinate. You see that picture of him there with a telescope to his eye, except early in his career, he lost his eye. And when he saw a signal he didn't like from the fleet admiral, he would often put the telescope to the bad eye and say, "I see no signal here, proceed to port." He was a difficult, willful subordinate. That's where the expression, by the way, to turn a blind eye to something actually comes from. Lord Nelson, again, that complexity of character. Let's come home to America. This is Alfred Thayer Mahan. And you see that picture. He's not a warm and chummy kind of person. He sort of personifies Dostoevsky's quote that an intellectual is a man with spectacles on his nose and winter in his heart. This is Alfred Thayer Mahan. He is the intellectual genius of the United States Navy. He builds the entire strategic framework in the late 1800s and early 1900s, which we still use today. The idea of a global Navy is Alfred Thayer Mahan. He essentially founds the Naval College in Newport, Rhode Island. But his problem is that he has no, we would say in today's parlance, he has no life balance. He would rather be in a room with his books, with his research, writing his great ideas, but he has no human connection. Again, that duality of character. Let's go to someone who had a big personality. This is Sir Jackie Fisher, who was a famous British admiral at the end of the 19th century. Famous for everywhere he went, innovating, full of brilliant ideas. He takes the British Navy from the age of sail through coal to liquid fuel. He essentially invents the ideas that we think of today as torpedoes and submarines. He's an incredible inventor. He is also, as he ages, becomes a mentor to the young Winston Churchill. He's famous for criticizing his own service, the British Navy, for its failed traditions, which he claims are rum, buggery, and the lash. He is someone who breaks apart convention, an enormous innovator, but he is the ultimate, it's all about me kind of character. Everywhere he goes, it has to be about Jackie Fisher. And he makes fatal errors in judgment as a result of that. Again, this duality of character that we see again and again. So here's an admiral who is, in fact, just about perfect. No surprise to this audience, he's a Texan. He's from Fredericksburg, Texas. This is Chester Nimitz, born just west of here. And he comes from this landlocked part of our country, goes to the U.S. Naval Academy, and becomes the greatest admiral in American history, full stop. What makes him unique is his resilience, his calm temperament. And let me describe it to you. September 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor, the U.S. fleet is destroyed. All of those magnificent battleships are sunk in Pearl Harbor. The carriers are out at sea dodging the Japanese. He's the one who gets the call at that moment to go and become the commander of this broken fleet. And he takes command of the Pacific Fleet, not as he always hoped he would, in his beautiful service dress white, standing on the deck of a gorgeous battleship on a fine day in Hawaii. He takes command on the deck of a tiny diesel submarine. That's all that's left. The smell of cordite, explosives, is still in the air. Bodies of American sailors are being pulled out of our battleships. Yet he squares his shoulders, he builds a team, and for the next 4 years, he never raises his voice, never loses his temper, calmly, steadily moves on to defeat the Japanese Empire. And I can give you that trajectory in 2 ships. One is the Arizona. If you've never been to Hawaii to go see the sacred temple of the United States Navy, go see USS Arizona. That's where the war begins. The other ship is USS Missouri, the battleship Missouri. That's where the surrender is signed in Tokyo Bay. The architect of that arc of that trajectory of victory is Chester Nimitz, his steadiness, his calmness, his grace under pressure, as Hemingway said. Who else? Here's one not too many people know, but it's Admiral Elmo Zumwalt. He's a 1970s reformer. And instead of, like Jackie Fisher, changing the British Navy technologically, Elmo Zumwalt changes the social engineering of our Navy. He's the first chief of naval operations to go sit in the mess decks with our sailors. He fully integrates the United States Navy, which has been kind of integrated, maybe not so much, through the 60s. He deeply cares about people. He is an innovator in the zone of social engineering and widely regarded as well as a lightness of spirit. There's much to love about Admiral Zumwalt. Let's go to the other end of the personality register. This is a man named Hyman Rickover, brilliant nuclear engineer. He is the one who invents the idea of putting a nuclear reactor on a submarine. Think about that for a minute. Taking it to the bottom of the ocean. He then puts nuclear power in our aircraft carriers, our cruisers and destroyers. He changes the face of the Navy. But he's endlessly difficult with subordinates. He demeans them. He yells at people. In today's parlance, he is a toxic leader. The chapter in the book about Hyman Rickover is called The Master of Anger. And the point is, in everyone's character, there exists this personal zone where people either use their calmness, their devotion to others, the servant leader quality that we see in a Chester Nimitz, or they use the anger of a Rickover to drive change and accomplish great things. And we all have to judge for ourselves whether the accomplishment is worth the anger in the case of someone like Rickover. Very difficult leader. Which brings us to number 10. In many ways, my favorite. Amazing Grace, we call her in the Navy. Grace Hopper. Here's her story. She gets a PhD in mathematics from Yale University in the 1930s. Think about that for a minute. She then is teaching at Columbia in 1941 when the war breaks out. And she immediately says, I want to serve my country, I want to join the Navy. She goes to a recruiting office and they look at her and they say, you can't join the Navy, you don't weigh enough. She weighs 104 pounds, minimum weight 120. Dr. Hopper goes off and starts drinking milkshakes, eating burgers. It's a good problem to have. Gains the weight, joins the Navy, and becomes the most brilliant computer scientist in the history of the Navy. She's on a team that effectively invents what we think of as machine language. She writes COBOL. She is the mother of COBOL. And she was also very glamorous. She was really an extraordinary person who everybody loved to be around. Grace Hopper, that Navy destroyer is named after her. Above all, with Grace Hopper, I'd say she was deeply intellectually curious. That's what led her to her accomplishments in an age in which hardly the norm for women to step up into such important jobs. I met her when I was a young midshipman, and she was an older admiral. She served, by the way, as an admiral longer than anybody in U.S. Navy history other than Hyman Rickover. He was the father of the nuclear Navy. She was the mother of COBOL. With Hyman Rickover, I met him as well. I just tried to stay out of his line of sight. With Grace Hopper, you just wanted to be around her. She always had a joke or a kind word, and she was brilliant. So right about now, you ought to say, gosh, okay, Admiral, that's 10 extraordinary admirals, interesting lives. What are the qualities? What are the attributes of character that you can pull out from these stories? Well, let's talk about a couple. I'm going to start with the one that I think is most important in determining character in anybody. And it may or may not surprise you. I think it's this. It's the ability to listen. It's empathy. It's humor. It is listening. This, by the way, is not Photoshop. This is an actual Belgian air defense system. And it is quite innovative for his day. The officer is listening for incoming aircraft. I put it here to remind us that perhaps the essential element of character is the ability to listen, not just to your boss, but to your teammates, your peers, your subordinates, but also to listen to the other, to the opponent, to the one with whom you have the disagreement. And this may be the greatest difficulty we face in our society today. And here I'm talking to you, whether you are a morning Joe, let's go through the day on MSNBC and you're with Rachel Maddow at night, or you're on the white couch over here on Fox News in the morning and you can't wait to hear what Sean Hannity's going to tell you at night. I don't care. I'm a centrist. I'm a registered independent. We need this ability to construct the conversations, to solve the problems that we have. I put Nimitz here because of all these admirals. Nimitz is the one who personified that. How about intellectual curiosity, building intellectual capital? Grace Hopper, when she died, she had 10,000 books in her small 2-bedroom apartment in New York City. And by the way, it's not just the nonfiction we read, because at the end of your life, we were talking about Clay Christensen, you'll measure your life by the people you influence, and I would say you will measure your mind by the intellectual capital you have developed, by the books you've read, by the conferences like Culturati you attend, because your education only starts on the day you leave the university. These are some nonfiction books I've read lately. Read a few novels. Figure out that a novel is a time machine that can drop you into another situation. If you haven't read Margaret Atwood's The Testament, the sequel to The Handmaid's Tale, it is a story about what it is like to live in an authoritarian society. It's heartbreaking, and she crushes it. You want to understand China and why they are struggling now with coronavirus? Read the novel Waiting, set in hospitals in China, about the gap between rural and urban in China. So intellectual curiosity is that quality of character that I think matters deeply. Grace Hopper personified that. How about values? Our values. It's really the basis of what we gather to talk about over this day. And our values come to us from the Greeks, from the East, from the Enlightenment, that's the young Voltaire, through our founding fathers, to principled leaders like Angela Merkel of Germany. I put Zumwalt on this, who cared deeply about all of our values: democracy, liberty, freedom of speech, gender equality, racial equality. Look, we execute them imperfectly, but they're the right values. And I'll tell you a very quick story about values, and it comes from this photograph. I was given this photograph as a gift about 15 years ago by someone who said to me, "Admiral, you're going to love this picture. It's a beautiful Navy ship, 1949, its crew out in front of it." So I started looking closely at this, and I found something strange. Here's a military formation. Everything is supposed to be symmetrical, right? These are the officers. That's the crew. Look at that second rank. Look right there. See that gap? 3 people missing. These are 3 chief petty officers who are missing. So I started looking really closely at this photograph, and I found the 3 missing Chief Petty Officers. There are 3 African Americans. Right back there. Yeah, correct reaction. My Navy, 1949. This is a character failure. And I don't know what happened, but I'll give you a pretty good guess. My guess is the number 2 officer on the ship set up the photograph, which is quite typical, and then the captain would have come down to take the picture, walk down the gangplank. That's the captain. We know he's the captain because he has these scrambled eggs on his cap. He has kind of a grumpy look on his face here. Yeah, my guess is he came down, those 3 chiefs were right where they belonged. And he said, you 3, get to the back, stand with your division in the back. 1949. I show you this for 2 reasons. One is, every day we ought to ask ourselves, what am I doing today that in 70 years is going to look oh so wrong? And secondly, look closely at things. When you first see that picture, you think, wow, that's a beautiful Navy ship. Maybe not so much. Teamwork, I'll wrap up with this. Teamwork is crucial, and it is a quality I saw again and again in these admirals. This is a pretty routine maritime operation at sea. It's a takedown of a dhow with pirates on it. I commanded many missions like this. But what makes this unique is that these French special forces here, French, came out of an Italian helicopter, was refueled by a Danish frigate, had a U.S. maritime patrol aircraft overhead, operating on intelligence that was provided, punchline here, by the Islamic Republic of Iran. This is one of the few areas where Iran and the West have in fact cooperated. Building teams, even with those whom we have significant disagreements, is a powerful part of character. I'll stop with this one, I think, and it is about communication, because so much of what we do in character is about, as was described earlier, moving our values at scale. And you're looking at this and you're thinking, okay, retired admiral, these must be shipping lanes. No. Aircraft routes? No. Fiber optic cables? No. This is Facebook. World according to Facebook. Brighter the white, higher the concentration of Facebook use. 2.4 billion people on Facebook. The tell, if you're a poker player, is that China is dark. Because China has built not the Great Wall of China, they've built the Great Firewall of China. And those social networks are internal to China. This will be another challenge for China in dealing with coronavirus. We got to be in this zone. We got to move our values here. And our values are the right ones. But our problem is we think of it sometimes as a war of ideas. No, it's a marketplace of ideas. We got to compete in the marketplace. And by the way, you got to do it at scale, and you got to do it at retail. This is me as the Supreme Allied Commander with my opposite number, the Supreme Commander of the Russian Armed Forces, Nikolai Makarov. I always liked General Makarov. As you can see, he's a man of normal height. This was a very important meeting with Secretary Defense Bob Gates. Called me up and said, how'd the meeting go with Makarov, Stavridis? And I said, sir, it was great. We saw everything eye to eye. So let me close. This is character. I'm Greek, so I'm required to have a Greek myth in every presentation. You know Sisyphus. This is character. That boulder will roll back down. Again and again and again in these admirals and the people I've met in my life and times, it's resilience that drives character. And character can be like this. Eventually, in this voyage of character, you can get to this place. And the final image is right there. I love this photograph. was taken about 5 years ago. These are Somali migrants standing on a beach on the Red Sea. And prosaically, they're lifting up their phones, trying to get a better signal. Newsflash, doesn't work. But metaphorically, what's happening here? They are reaching for the light. They are reaching for the light. They want to connect. They want to join. They want to move on. This is a picture of hope. And if you remember nothing else from our evening together, remember this quote from Napoleon Bonaparte. I love to quote Napoleon because short people have to stick together at all times. Napoleon Bonaparte said, "A leader is a dealer in hope, not in fear." A leader is a dealer in hope. Of all the qualities we've talked about, the qualities of character, the one that triumphs in the end is hope. A leader is a dealer in hope. Thank you very much. A pleasure being with you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Josh. Sure.
Okay, we have time for 5 minutes of questions. So who wants to go first? I'll run this mic to you. All right.
My son just joined the Navy.
Thank you.
And tell him to call me.
I can do that. And if you catch me right over here, I'm going to give you my email address, and you have him email me, and I'll tell him to call his mama. That was the best question I've ever had.
Who else? Who else? You made a comment this afternoon about cybersecurity, and I want to know if you really think we're in trouble or not.
I think we are in trouble. And if you look again and again at challenges, I would put cyber at the top of the list, truly. And that surprises people often. But when I was Supreme Allied Commander, people would ask me, you know, Admiral, what really keeps you awake at night? Is it Afghanistan, Libya, the Balkans, piracy, Russia, China? We ought to be concerned about all those things. But in all of those things, the level of threat is met by the level of preparation. Cyber, not so much. Cyber, that level of threat is up here, and our level of preparation is down here. Let me give you another way to think about it. And I'm going to do it with a tale of two scientists. So indulge me here. Let's imagine I can snap my finger and bring back to life any scientist in history, right? So, Alexander Graham Bell. What did Alexander Graham Bell invent? Telephone, right? So if Dr. Bell were here, I would say, Dr. Bell, here is a telephone, except no wires, can communicate point to point anywhere in the world, can access all the world's knowledge, can play any symphony ever recorded. It is an extraordinary device. He would look at it like, you know, my basset hound looks at a wristwatch. I mean, it makes no sense, right? Go away, Dr. Bell. Let me snap my fingers again. Thomas Alva Edison. What did he invent? Light bulbs. What he most importantly did was build the first grid. Technically, he discovered you can run electricity in parallel. He built the first grid in New York City. Here's the point. If I said to him, let me show you the plans for the electric grid of the United States, and I rolled them out, Thomas Alva Edison would say, okay, let's see. This is source, wires, transformer, wires, substation, wires, another transformer, wires, load. Yeah, I got it. I can help you with this. He's 122 years old. We have made enormous strides here in the movement of information. We are utterly dependent on it. Yet all of this requires that electric grid. If you want to read one book about this, it's by Gretchen Baki. It's called The Grid. And that is the principal vulnerability we face, is that electric grid. I have a full hour I can terrify you with cyber about.
Just stop. Okay, we have time for one more question.
Hi, Admiral Stavridis. First, thank you for your service.
Thank you.
And Efcharisto for this book.
Efcharisto πολύ πατριώτη.
Sorry, we're Greeks. That's what we do. We start talking in Greek. My question is, I'm sure during your time you've worked with great leaders and maybe some not so great leaders.
Sure.
How do you go about working with people that you do not see eye to eye with, and I don't mean height-wise?
Yeah. No, this is a great question. And we've all experienced this, right? Every single person in this room has worked for someone who is a difficult leader for them, certainly. I think first, talk to your peers. This is where your peers can be extraordinarily helpful in helping you understand where the situation actually is. Because if it's about you and this one particular leader, sometimes you need outside perspective, so peers. Number two, never do anything unethical, illegal, immoral, but recognize that your boss has a right to his or her views, and thus you want to be supportive up to the point of hitting a moral, legal, or ethical break point. So point two is know where the boundaries are and establish those clearly in your own mind. And number three, keep a sense of humor. Don't take every single thing that happens as the most serious, searing moment. Try and find a sense of perspective. And all three of those things I think are important, but also, and I'll close with this, have a plan B. Have an exit. I'll give you a picture that I always kept on the wall in my office, everywhere I was. And it's a picture of that ship. This is the USS Maine. Famously, it blew up in Havana Harbor, February 15th, 1898, exploded. It was the work, the Navy said, of Spanish terrorists. This is why we got into the Spanish-American War. Remember the Maine. This is the Maine in that story. Over 100 sailors died. 50 years later, the Navy went back and salvaged this thing. And we discovered that the Maine did not blow up because of a terrorist mine on the side. It blew up because of an internal boiler explosion. So I keep a picture of the Maine on my wall wherever I am. Wherever my office at the Carlyle Group in Washington has this watercolor hanging there. Because you need to have a plan B in case your ship blows up. And you need to know where the boundaries are before you charge off to war with your boss, right? I think we have time for one more. This lady back here has been very patient. Yes, ma'am.
Why do you feel there aren't stronger penalties to poor character? Why do we put up with it?
Yeah, I'll repeat the question. Why aren't there stronger, I'll interpret slightly, stronger penalties for malfeasance of character? Why do we have toxic leaders? Why are people allowed to fail? Two words, human nature. We are, first of all, many of us have character flaws. I certainly do. So does everyone. And I think there's a kind of a tendency toward empathy with the failures of others, and that, I think, is appropriate. On the other hand, back to the point I made with my Greek colleague here, know where the boundaries are. Know what's immoral, unethical, illegal. When people violate those kind of borders, they should be held accountable. And thus, in our society, we tend to bend the edges of those three things. And I think that it's because it's easier to do that than to confront. And that, I think, is an important aspect of becoming a good leader, is the willingness to know where the boundaries are and confront those who are violating them. because when you walk by a violation like that, you own it as a leader or a peer or even a subordinate. Let me close with one last thought. And it kind of bounces off the very nice comment you made to me about service. People say that to me a lot. Thank you for your service, and I deeply appreciate that. I spent 37 years in the Navy. Here's my point. There are so many ways to serve this country, right? So definitely military, but how about our diplomats, our CIA officers, our NSA officers, our police, our firemen? How about our teachers? How about nurses in inner city clinics working for nothing? How about Peace Corps volunteers? How about Teach for America, Volunteer for America? EMTs who are volunteering. Many of you are volunteering in countless ways. I want to go back to teachers. You think a school teacher in rural West Texas, starting salary $26,000 a year, teaching a packed classroom, is serving the country? I do. So here's my ask. It's really two asks. One is, when you meet others who are serving the country, thank them. Thank the military, for sure. We appreciate that. We deserve it. Thank others. Thank a teacher. Thank a returning Peace Corps volunteer. Thank a fireman. There are a lot of people serving the country. That's number one ask. Number two is encourage others to serve. Find ways to serve yourself, because service is bipartisan. Service is nonpartisan. And I think service together as Americans, recognizing it, participating in it, can be a significant and important part of overcoming the acrimony in this angry political season. So I'll close by saying thank you for spending some time with me this evening, and thank all of you for your service as well. Thank you. It's a pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you. Thank you, Josh. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Josh. We really appreciate you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Give it one more time for Jim.
Very fine. Thank you.
And indeed, thanks to all of you for being here. I think this year, our fifth Culturati is a vibrant community. We're so thankful you put aside the time, you put aside the budget, you're putting aside your brain and your heart to be with us. We're so excited that you're here. Thank you, thank you. Anne wants you to know that the hashtag is Culturati20, not Culturati 2020, as I used mistakenly early in the day. Apologies. Autumn would like you to know that in the schedule, a few of you are a little bit confused because the name of the room is Antones, and the name of another room is ACL, and we mean the name commemorating Antones and the room commemorating ACL inside of Capital Factory, not the actual Antones or the actual ACL. Do you see what I'm saying? Does that make sense? Don't go to actual Antones. We won't be there. Okay, cool. You're going to go off to these dinners. These dinners are one of our favorite things. They're a longtime Culturati tradition. I'm super excited because usually we go around and visit a whole bunch of dinners, and this time we're just staying put in one, and that'll be just a delight to be with you. These dinners, as most of you know, are scattered throughout the city of Austin at the homes of CEOs. It's a curated 10, 12, 14-person whole table conversation. So as you go there, put yourself into that mind of sort of being able to listen, making one point at a time, being able to take the conversation in a place that's maybe a little bit deeper, thinking aloud from the edge with each other, letting go of all your PR speaking points, perhaps in confidentiality with each other. That's what makes these dinners wonderful. You get a tribe that's with you the whole next day, and many of these dinners continue, and folks continue to get together, and these collaborations come up, and it's really cool to watch all of that happen. So have a wonderful time at your dinners. I think that's it. We start at 8 a.m. tomorrow. So 8 a.m. is like, come on in, have some breakfast, meet some people, be late a little bit, and at 8:30, we're gonna really start. So those of you like me who are challenged to be places on time, the real start time for real is 8:30. You know what I'm saying? Okay, cool. Thanks so much. Go to dinner. We'll see you tomorrow morning.